I'm Larry Castle. This is Ken Brown. Thanks for joining us for episode 9 for August 2nd of That's a Good Question. We began last week talking about, we introduced the topic for this week, actually never got to it. We talked about the fact of all of the things going on with coronavirus, the things that we've talked about related to race relations, and kind of a connective tissue or thread going through all of these subjects is politics. And so we wanted to devote at least one episode to really just talking about Christians and politics. And so we'll do that this week. Let's start off just defining what we mean when we say politics.
Yeah, so let's go back to where we get the word itself, the etymology of the word. It's a Greek word polis. It means city, and so we have that in our English language. We have cities like Minneapolis, that is the water city, and you've got Indianapolis. It's the city of Indian land, so Indianapolis. And so politics then came to mean the organization of the city or the organization of the citizens. And then a politician is somebody who has been empowered in order to do that organizing of the city and of the citizens. Thankfully, for us in a democracy, the politicians are given that power. They are authorized to exercise that power. They don't just assume the power. They don't just take the power for themselves. It's granted to them by the consent of the governed. And it's important for us as we talk about politics to remember this distinction between authority and power. This has always been a very helpful thing for me to remember, that power means you have the ability to do something. Authority means you have the right, you have the authorization to do something.
Helpful, important distinction.
And you can have one without the other. So if somebody has a gun, they've got power. They've got the ability to wield their will over you. If they hold a gun to your head, then they can make you do things against your will. So they have power, but they're not authorized to make you do those things. They don't have the right to make you do those things. You can have someone who is authorized, but they've been stripped of their power. And sometimes that can happen with, for example, police or military. We can authorize them. We can say, you have the right to go and protect a city, go and send our soldiers over and protect a land. But if we don't give them the tools to do that, if we don't give them the power, they can have authority but not have the power. Yeah. So you can have one without the other. What's ideal is when the power is authorized, when the person that has been given the ability by those that are governed has been authorized by those over whom they are wielding that power. I have a pastor friend then who defines politics this way. I'm not sure if it's original with him, but he says politics is the stewardship of power, the stewardship of power.
So let's flesh that out a bit then. How does that definition play out for those who hold positions of power then, and for those of us who put them in that position?
So I think that definition, the stewardship of power, encapsulates the important components of how politicians should, if they were looking at it from a biblical worldview, it's the way they should understand their work. So what does stewardship mean? We say it's a stewardship of power. Stewardship, I remind you, is a management or an administration. It's used in the Bible. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus told the parable of the faithful steward, and this faithful steward or this faithful manager was administrating the affairs of his master. That's the place where Jesus said famously, to him whom much is given, much will be required. So the idea is God has given us all management responsibility. We are all stewards. We are all given by him certain portions of what belong to him, and what he has entrusted to us is to be managed for his purposes. And he's going to come and check. That's what judgment for Christians is going to be about. We're not going to be judged as a Christian for whether we go to heaven or hell. We are going to be judged with regard to what we did with what God entrusted to us. So to him whom much is given, much will be required. The Apostle Paul used it in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. He said, it is necessary for a steward that he be found faithful. So all of Christian life, when you think about it, now that we understand what stewardship is, it's managing what's been entrusted to you on the part of someone else for the master's benefit. So all of life then is, Christian life is stewardship. You know, we've been entrusted by God to manage what he's given us for his purposes. So that's true of our possessions, it's true of our time, it's true of our gifts and abilities, our talents. It's also true of our liberties as citizens. God has given us these liberties, but he expects us to manage those. He's entrusted this to us. So the right to vote and the right for us all as citizens to entrust other people with this power to organize the city, organize the citizens, that's a stewardship that we carry out. You know, we have to manage that on God's behalf. As I think about who am I going to vote for, who am I going to entrust that power to? Voting is a stewardship of who's going to wield that very important power.
Makes sense. So we should then, it seems, certainly be involved in that aspect of politics, voting. And we can talk about later whether or not a Christian should get involved beyond that. But as we think about, at least in the modern era, Christian conservatives, Christians in general, are a very sought-after voting bloc.
Yeah, right.
And as such, we've seen a lot more involvement, visible involvement by Christians. Let's talk about, has that always been the case?
Yeah, it's right what you said, that conservative Christians are an organized bloc. I mean, there are multiple groups of values voters and family values kinds of organizations that politicians court in order to get their votes. And these are populated by primarily conservative evangelical Christians. But that's a fairly recent phenomenon. It's something that's occurred within my lifetime. In the 70s, in the early 70s, mid 70s, you had little to no organized involvement on the part of evangelical conservative Christians. Prior to that, and I'll explain what evangelical Christian is in a minute, but we were primarily uninvolved in politics other than just voting. So political involvement by religious folks at that time, you know, prior to the mid to late 70s, prior to that, it was mostly those in what are called liberal or mainline churches, liberal mainline denominations. Now, what is that? So very, very quickly, a little over 100 years ago, in church history, we had something called the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Modernist is a synonym for liberal, fundamentalist liberal. Liberals, modernists were denying cardinal doctrines of Christianity. They were denying that the Bible is without error. They were saying the Bible has errors in it. They were denying things like the bodily, physical resurrection of Christ. And this was happening at denominational seminaries. One example of that would be Princeton Seminary, and Princeton Seminary was a Presbyterian seminary. So when I talk about Princeton, I'm talking about the famous Princeton University and Princeton Seminary. That was a Presbyterian organization, and they started to deny these things. And you had faculty members who became extremely concerned about that. Some of them believed the Bible was without error, all of these cardinal doctrines of the faith. 5 of them left in 1929. And they went a few miles away to Philadelphia, and they started a new seminary, Westminster Theological Seminary. I wrote on my blog a couple of weeks ago, the Church Matters blog, about a theologian from Westminster named J. Gresham Machen. And Machen was one of those 5 who left Princeton and helped found Westminster. So those who believed the Bible and these cardinal doctrines, they left to start their own associations and their own schools. Now, they're evangelicals or fundamentalists, but a broader term is evangelical. And in a nutshell, an evangelical is someone who believes that there needs to be a point in time in the life of an individual where they've come in contact with the evangel. That's why the name evangelical.
The gospel.
The gospel. So the evangel is the gospel. They've come in contact with the gospel, and there's been a conversion experience. And if you wanted to just put it in very simple terms, the difference between an evangelical then and a liberal or mainline Protestant would be that a liberal mainline Protestant puts their emphasis upon Christian nurture. In fact, many of the liberal theologians of 100 years ago, 150 years ago, wrote books with that theme, very much that theme, even with that title, Christian nurture. And the idea was that someone becomes a Christian. A Christian is shaped, made, rather than born. Whereas an evangelical says, no, they're born. They're made, they are born and then they are matured.
Yeah.
But you don't make a Christian by their environment.
It's not just a changing through behavior modification and
Exactly.
philosophy over time.
So, in liberal mainline denominations, you'll have a child that they're initiated into the community of faith as an infant, and then they are nurtured in that faith, and they go through a whole process of confirmation and all that. Not all those things are bad. I'm not, there's something to this idea of having some intentional instruction and a point at which you say, yes, I understand this, and you are confirmed in that. So it's not all bad. In our churches and our tradition, we don't generally have that for our children, but I'm not personally opposed to that idea. But the problem is when it becomes the vehicle of making a Christian. We're not making a Christian. One has to become a Christian, as we know. They have to be born again, and that's what an evangelical believes.
And that's our aversion to that model is driven by a desire to not just see somebody conform externally.
That's right.
But we're recognizing that this is a heart change,
That's right.
A change of allegiance.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
who we're depending on. Yeah.
And so now you can see how that might translate into the political realm then. Because if you're very much into environmental change and by nurturing someone along by their environment, bringing them up in the Christian faith, that's what it's all about, as opposed to that being initiated by a born-again experience, well, then you can see how that would easily translate into the societal realm, that the way society is changed is the same way individuals are changed. They're changed by the environment.
Yeah.
So we need to get involved in changing the structures of society. And as a result of that, you found in the 50s and in the 60s, when there was a lot of very important work going on in politics, in society in general, about things that we talked about a few weeks ago, civil rights, and trying to overcome the legacy of racism and slavery in our country. That was led, as far as religious people were involved, that was led by liberal mainline religionists, Protestants. Conservatives were not involved in that at all.
And I'm going off of, this is much of it before my time, but not too much. And it seems as I look back on some of that, and even some of the acquaintance I've had with it from those spheres as I was, a young man growing up in those circles, there was unnecessarily some opposition to some otherwise good things from us. That's what we talked about before. Why, what is our culpability in that, or our predecessors?
Yes, yeah, that's right. And so there was a lot of opposition to that, and it came back to bite some of those who opposed, because during the 60s, Martin Luther King himself was, of course, a minister. He had gone to seminary, and much, if not most, of the black leadership in the civil rights movement were ministers, trained ministers, but of the liberal persuasion, not the evangelical persuasion. And so you had conservative ministers who were being asked, hey, why don't you get involved? Why don't we get involved? And they say, hey, that's not my calling. That's not what I do. Well, later, as we're going to see, suddenly that became their calling. And so that difference, that frankly hypocrisy, came back to bite them. And one person in particular who was very deft at turning that and turning it into kind of a joke because he knew it was a liability for him, it was Jerry Falwell, the late Jerry Falwell Sr. In the 60s, he was down in Lynchburg, Virginia. He had Thomas Road Baptist Church. He was getting that going. that was starting to grow, and he was asked, why don't you get involved in this? And he said, that's not my calling. I'm a preacher of the gospel. That's not what we get into. Then he said there were some sermons, though. Later, he would say, there are sermons I'd like to buy back if I could.
That's among them.
Yeah. And James Dobson, I remember hearing James Dobson talk about how evangelicals for a very long time didn't get involved in politics because they thought it was dirty, that was a realm that was beneath the dignity of Christians, and so we kind of abandoned that. But as a result of not getting involved, Dobson was starting to make the point, and others were making the point, that we now have given that to secularists. If Bible-believing people don't get involved, then who are you leaving it to? So you're leaving it to liberals, and you're leaving it to secularists. And so in the late 70s and the 80s, you heard much talk about secular humanism. I don't know if you remember that, but that was a big theme. Secular humanism is taking over our schools. Yeah. That then started to motivate conservative Christians to begin to get involved. But prior to the mid-late 70s, they were not.
Yeah, and so we'll talk about this later. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but that is why, or I guess maybe a way to describe that is us making the mistake of thinking we shouldn't be involved versus thinking about how we should be involved. And we'll talk about that a little later. So let's talk now about what changed then in the 70s, such that conservative, and you kind of led us into that already, such that conservative evangelicals did get involved. Talk more about that.
So if you've been watching our That's a Good Question episodes, you may remember a few episodes ago we talked about the fact that the Supreme Court has been getting cases for the last several decades that are of a different sort than they used to get. With the change in our culture overall to a post-Christian culture, you now have cases coming before the Supreme Court that are bubbling up because there are changes taking place in the society. So abortion, what is the definition of marriage? Those kinds of things weren't part of the Supreme Court docket in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. But since the 60s, they have very much become part of that. Well, now, as a result of that, then conservative Christians, remember what conservative is. We talked about it last week. You're trying to conserve something. So if you're trying to conserve these moral values and you see those being eroded, you can see now how people might start to get excited, concerned, and then involved. And that's exactly what happened. So with regard to abortion, Francis Schaeffer, some of you will know that name, the late, great theologian and philosopher Francis Schaeffer. In the 70s, he teamed up with a man named C. Everett Koop. C. Everett Koop later became the Surgeon General of the United States under President Ronald Reagan.
It's the first Surgeon General I remember.
The first, okay. And he was famous, world renowned in the 70s.
For the beard.
Well, he had this, so those of you who know Coop, he had that kind of
press pause,
funky,
do a Google search.
Beard. And then, of course, there's Francis Schaeffer, who always looked like he crawled out from under a rock. He put those two guys together, right? So
I'm working on a look like that.
But they're both brilliant guys, just brilliant guys. And Coop was world renowned because he was the lead pediatrician at Philadelphia Children's Hospital. And he had performed the first successful separation of Siamese twins there. And so he had achieved world renown, but he was an evangelical Christian. And then you have Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer is a conservative, Bible-believing Presbyterian. He had started in Switzerland, L'Abri Fellowship, and young people from all over the world came to L'Abri to sit at the feet of Francis Schaeffer. And he was discussing, Schaeffer was, things that these young people were very interested in, especially because of the upheaval of the 60s. Well, okay, what is truth? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? And where does the Christian fit into the overall society? And out of that, he wrote a book. It's kind of his magnum opus called How Shall We Then Live? But he teamed up with Koop in, I think it was 76, to write a book called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And that book was about life issues, life and death issues. It dealt with abortion primarily, but also euthanasia, end-of-life issues as well, and how the Supreme Court fits into that. It was a book, and it also was a movie. I remember seeing that. I remember reading those books, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, How Shall We Then Live, being greatly impacted by them. Then a group of ministers got together, prominent conservative ministers got together. They formed something called the Christian Roundtable, and they did that to discuss how can we mobilize to get our people involved, to understand the seriousness of these issues, to now start electing people who understand the seriousness of these issues, getting judges on the court who will take a conservative originalist that we talked about a few weeks ago approach to their interpretation. Christian Roundtable. And then the granddaddy of all of those organizations was the Moral Majority.
This is the name I recognize. Yeah.
Moral Majority. And that was started by the late Jerry Falwell Sr. And that's why, I joked earlier, and he would joke, there are some sermons I would like to have back, because here he was in the 60s saying, hey, that's not my job, it's not what I do. And now here he is in the late 70s and well into the 80s, and he's very much at the fore. He is the face and the voice of conservative evangelicals and their involvement in the political sphere.
Yeah, and this is all very well known to you. You've had some personal involvement in that, right? This is as you're going through college, and you told me a little bit about that. Let's share that with us.
Yeah, so full disclosure here.
You get the big sigh as you begin this.
I graduate from 76 is when Whatever Happened to the Human Race comes out. Francis Schaeffer Coop, all of that's going on. And I'm in high school at that point. I graduate in 80 from high school. That fall, begin college. But I become very interested in these issues at that time. I'm following what the Moral Majority is doing very closely. In fact, not just following what they're doing very closely, I become a card-carrying member of the of the Moral Majority. I literally had a card with my name on it.
That's not just a figure of speech.
I literally had my
Did you ever
card.
have to pull it out and show it?
I don't think I did. But I devoured Francis Schaeffer's books. I think he wrote 22 books in his lifetime, and I read them all, and with great profit. I attended rallies that Jerry Falwell and his school put on. They were called I Love America rallies. I went to pro-life protests. I went to one, for example, in Kalamazoo, Michigan here, and at that time the Upjohn pharmaceutical company was headquartered in Kalamazoo. And it was Upjohn that had developed the RU 486 morning after pill, which was an abortifacient. And so that in the pro-life movement had made quite a splash, and it was caused great concern. And so there were rallies outside the headquarters of Upjohn, and I'm in Kalamazoo, and I'm part of those. And in my first year in college, one of the classes that I took, this professor, it was a history class, but this professor gave us all a questionnaire, and he asked us to fill it out, and it included putting on there, what are your interests? And I put on this, my two interests were the two things you're never supposed to talk about, religion and politics. But that's what I put on there.
You've been talking about them ever since.
Exactly. Religion and politics. So I'm 18, I turned this thing in. I don't know why he's asking for it. That was unusual. Most professors didn't do that. But then sometime later in the semester, he asked me to stay after class. And he said that we have gotten a request from a senator's office. And that was in Michigan here, a liberal Democratic senator at the time named Don Regal. He had, of course, his office in D.C., but he had an office here in Detroit as well. And they were looking for an intern there. And he said, I saw that you put that you're interested in politics. And so I jumped at that opportunity and still very much look back with great fondness at the time I was able to do that during the summer of 1981 and that internship in Regal's office. So yeah, I've been interested in these things for a long time.
Yeah. And so as you then talk about that era and all of these initiatives and involvement, what was the outcome of all of this mobilization by Christians?
So what happens is, I said that was the summer of 81 that I'm able to do that internship. Well, just months before that, in January of 81, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the president. So that was a crowning achievement of all of this stuff that had been going on in the 70s and the Christian Roundtable and the moral majority. And evangelical Christians were given great credit for putting Ronald Reagan in office, that he had put together a coalition of these conservative Christians and was able to get them out to the polls and to vote for him. And here he is then, he's the president. And so it was a great success. It was hailed as a great success, and it established evangelicals now as a political force that needed to be taken into account, a special interest group that was to be courted. Now, I say that, and I'll just say that slowly again, a special interest group that's to be courted by politicians. And that may all sound great, and it sounded great to me when I was 18. But over time, if you think about it, you think about how religious people becoming a special interest group can potentially become a problem. Not necessarily, but potentially.
I'm just immediately thinking of the favor given to Christians in Rome at one point.
Yeah.
I might be connecting dots that don't necessarily need to be connected, but I do think of that.
Yeah. So this idea that we're going to be courted by politicians, what's that going to mean on our part? Then what are we going to give up, if anything, in order? What are we going to compromise? Because once you get in the political realm, guess what? You're in the compromise realm. And that's going to come back, I think, to bite us later on. But then it was the euphoria of, hey, this has worked. Ronald Reagan is the president. He's pro-life. The Republican Party platform is decidedly pro-life, becomes right in the platform itself, pro-life planks. And that has been the case up to this day. So it was very successful that way. You had Reagan elected. 1980 also brought in a Republican Senate, so Reagan was able to nominate judges. We talked about how that happens a few weeks ago. Senate has to confirm those. Well, guess what? They're all getting confirmed because he's got a Republican Senate. And then he gets reelected in 84, and then in 88, his vice president gets elected president. So you have 12 straight years. So that was quite a record, and so it was deemed to be a success.
And you, one of the things you mentioned to me as we prepared for the show is 24 of the last 40 years have had Republican pro-life presidents.
Yeah.
So all of this, and we think, well, hey, success, right?
Right.
Or not right?
Yeah, you would think 24 out of 40 years, 12 in a row, right there from 80 to 92, and yet here we are. Here we are in 2020, and Roe versus Wade is still the law of the land. If you had told someone in 1980 that would be the case 40 years later, I wouldn't have believed it. If you had told me in 1980 that there would be 12 straight years of a Republican president, and during that period of time, 5 judges would be confirmed to the Supreme Court by those 2 presidents, Reagan and Bush, and that we would still have Roe v. Wade, that it would not have been overturned, I wouldn't have believed that. But here we are. It's still the law of the land. And then marriage has been redefined, radically redefined. And not only that, but, and I'm going to say this, and I just say it, friends, and I hope you understand it in the context in which I'm saying all of this. I say it as someone who voted Republican, straight Republican ticket, actually, in 2016, which means my vote for president went to President Trump. But for the first time in my lifetime, evangelicals have overwhelmingly supported someone whose values, personal values, are diametrically opposed to what we stand for. And that's why I said earlier about being a special interest group that is courted, because now that begins to change what it is you value, what it is you look for, and how you go about getting it. And we've started to see that. So there may have been some wisdom way back in the 50s and 60s and 70s when evangelicals didn't get involved as much as they did, because it was dirty. Remember, Dobson said that? You know, it's dirty. That's not our realm. That's not what we do. And I just thought that was the craziest thing back then. But now I look at 40 years later, where we are and the compromises that are made. And I'm not advocating, in fact, we'll talk about it later, I'm not advocating disengaging by any means. I'm not disengaged, and I'm not advocating disengaging, but I am saying there were dangers, we were warned about the dangers, and now we can start to see that we're experiencing some of those dangers.
And that gets to what I was saying earlier, not whether we're involved, but how we're involved. And I think you've got some things that you can share with us about that. So how did it happen? As I asked that question, how did it happen that all of this could go right for us, and yet we still end up where we are with who we have as president, and with personal values so opposed to our own Christian values? How did we get here? Where did we go wrong?
So I am at this internship at Senator Don Riegel's office, and when I would go into the office, I was regularly talking to those that were in the office. These were paid staffers who were there. They were full-time people. I was an intern. But I had a chance to rub shoulders with them, go to lunch with them, talk politics with them, which was a great experience for me as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old at that point. But one of the ladies she was actually the chief of staff in that office, an older lady, very nice. She kind of took me under her wing, and she considered herself to be an evangelical Christian. It was very interesting. And here she is working for Don Riegel. And Don Riegel was very liberal. And I just couldn't put that together in my mind. And I told her that. And we talked about it a lot. This is the truth. I'm sure you all will believe me. But one time I was talking to her about my convictions with regard to these moral issues. And, you're helping someone and electing someone who is going the opposite direction of these moral issues, in particular on abortion. And she was weeping as we were talking about this. You could tell it weighed on her greatly. She was trying to work through it. And I was trying to work through it because, I liked her very much. I appreciated the fact that she was taking me under her wing. I enjoyed being in that environment. I thought that I might pursue politics myself, but I'm trying to figure that out. How can a Christian person do that? Well, what spot, if any, would there be for someone like me? And she gave me a book. And the book was by a guy named Paul Henry. Paul Henry was a congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, in D.C. And tragically, he died of a brain aneurysm at the age of 56 in 1993. But at the time, he was a congressman. Prior to that, he taught politics, political science at Calvin College in Grand Rapids. But Paul Henry was an evangelical Christian. He was the son of, some of you will know this name, Carl F.H. Henry, the famous theologian, and the founder of Christianity, first editor of Christianity Today magazine was Carl Henry. So Paul Henry was his son, and Paul Henry wrote this book, Politics for Evangelicals, and this lady gave this to me. And I read it, and Paul Henry overall had some very good things to say with regard to evangelical involvement in politics in that book. In 1985, Paul Henry, was interviewed by Christianity Today magazine, and I've got a quote here that I'd like to read regarding what he started to see in the mid-'80s already that was giving him concern about how Christians go about their involvement. This is what he said. He said, with the increased political activism of evangelicals in the late 1970s and 1980s, Christianity Today said, Paul became more concerned about how some Christians were getting involved than that they be involved. He cautioned that, quote, the real danger at this point in the evangelical community is not the mistaken notion that Christians ought not be involved. We're coming through that. Now the danger lies in how we're being involved and whether we're listening and following, as it were, the promptings of the Spirit, or simply manipulating religious symbols. And that's kind of a haunting phrase to me. Are we listening to the Spirit? Are we following the Lord? Are we following the sword of the Spirit, His Word? Or are we manipulating religious symbols? And I would say to you, dear friends, And I say to myself, as someone who enjoys politics, enjoys following what's happening, believes that I have a stewardship, a management responsibility to understand what is happening and plug all of that into a biblical worldview. And in my position as a pastor, to try to be able to help folks understand that from a biblical worldview. So I'm very much about that, and I think that's very important. But I am very, very concerned that when we get involved in the political realm, we can be manipulated. We can manipulate and be manipulated both. Mm-hmm. And we cannot ever sell our souls for the pottage of politics, of power. It's temporary. Mm. It's worldly power. And I've seen it happening. I've seen it happening for a very long time, and I see it happening in a big way now, not just now, so I'm not putting this all on where we are now. This has been happening for a long time. But when he uses that phrase, are we simply manipulating religious symbols? I think we may have seen the apex of that, honestly, on June 1st, just 2 months ago. And our president, some of you may remember this, but the streets were cleared of people that were protesting. There was a curfew at 7 o'clock, but it was 6:40. So the curfew wasn't there yet. And yet soldiers, armed military police clear out. And then you have the Secretary of Defense, and you have the Attorney General, and you have the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all of them coming out with the president, and they march across the street through Lafayette Square. And they stand in front of St. John's Episcopal Church, this historic church where presidents have worshiped over many, many, many years, for a photo op. And the photo op is in front of a church, but with the president, and everybody's seen this, with the holding the Bible. And it was like a 3-minute thing. And I just say that to just say, these are words spoken in 1985. Manipulating religious symbols. And here we are in 2020, and we've seen before our eyes that kind of thing happening. So Paul Henry was concerned in 1985. I didn't start to get concerned until the late 80s and early 90s. I began to become concerned about what this political involvement was doing to evangelicals and what evangelicals were doing in politics. Mm-hmm. Now, I wasn't alone. He wasn't alone in that. There's some other people that I'll tell you about, but I probably should check in. We're probably about done for today, you think?
Yeah, I think we can call it here. Yeah.
Okay.
About 37 minutes or so. All right, so this will be a 2-parter then. Not 3, because last week wasn't really the start of this. Yeah. So if you'd like to tune in next week, we'll conclude this conversation about Christians and politics, and we'll shift gears then, talking about, okay, so should Christians be involved, and if so, how? Okay. We'll start off with that next week. So thanks for tuning in and watching. And just a reminder, if you're watching this, you're probably watching it on our website or directly on our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe. If you want to be notified when a new episode comes out, you can hit the notification bell there on YouTube. Also follow us on Facebook so that you'll be kept up with any news and new materials we publish, including blog articles. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.